Thunder Cave, Chapter 11. On the way out of town, I rode by the refugee camp. The view from my bike was much worse than it had been from the cab. The people looked like walking skeletons. Flies crawled on their faces, and they were either too weak to brush them away, or they were so used to them that they didn't even care. Most of the refugees were from Somalia and Ethiopia, where the effects of the drought were worse than they were in Kenya. The stench of the camp burned my nostrils. I had purchased more food and heard the cans clanking together in the panniers as I rode. I felt guilty and thought about stopping and tossing the cans to them. But would it do any good? How long would it last if they were distributed in the camp? A day? 2 days? Then what? I rode on by with my food and my guilt. The heat shimmered over the Rift Valley in waves. It was unbelievably hot. About 20 miles outside of Nairobi, the land began to open up. I passed farms and ranches, acacia trees dotted with arid landscape. If it hadn't been for the zebras and the impalas standing in the field, I would have sworn I was back in the States, riding my bike along the country road on a very hot August day. The road was paved and narrow and full of potholes. Aside from an occasional bus or Land Rover, there was no traffic. Up ahead, I saw several large, dark birds surrounding a lump in the road. They hopped away awkwardly as I approached. I stopped for a moment next to the lump and saw that it was a road-killed hyena bloating in the heat. I held my breath and swatted at the swarm of flies buzzing around the carcass. The hyena's eyes were gone, and the white maggots squirmed around the empty sockets. The dark birds were vultures, too gorged with food to fly away. They stood 10 feet off the road waiting for me to leave so they could continue their feast. I pedaled down the road and did not let my breath out until I was well past the stink of the hyena. A few miles later, I passed 3 young Maasai about my age, walking along the road towards Nairobi. I wanted to stop and tell them that there was nothing in the city for them, but what would be the point? I simply waved, and one of them waved back, each carrying a long spear. They wore traditional red Maasai shuka, which looked like togas the ancient Romans wore. Their hair was braided and caked with red clay. They must have been young warriors called Morans. My father had told me that the Maasai are one of the few tribes that have maintained much of their culture. They are nomads, and their wealth is based on the number of cattle and goats they keep. The cows and nannies are milked and bled, and only on special occasions eaten. The Maasai live in small family communities called corrals. The corrals are encircled by a high wall of dried thorn bushes to keep predators and enemies out. Inside the corral are small huts made of sticks and plastered with cow dung. The Maasai follow the grass with their herds. I wondered how they were doing in the drought. So far, I hadn't seen a single blade of green grass. As I rode along, I smelled the sweet scent of heat, dust, and smoke. The only thing I heard was my breathing and my thoughts. I passed a small herd of wildebeests, and they saw me and ran a few hundred yards, stopped, and looked back. I knew that I would see a lot more of them. When the wildebeest are migrating, you'll see tens of thousands of them in one group making their way across the savannah. I stopped for a drink of water, finishing off my first bottle. I was still thirsty, and I only had 1 bottle left. Water could be a problem between towns. My plan was to camp alongside of the road and then reach the small town of Suswa the following morning to replenish my water supply. Then on to Narok, Ewaso, Negro, Barkatabu, and Moroja. Outside Narok the road wasn't paved, and this would slow me down. I'd have to keep my eyes open for sources of water. During the survival course in Arizona, I got high marks in finding water. If you can find water on a regular basis, you've solved 50% of your problems. The other problems were shelter and food. If it didn't take too long to get to my father's camp, I would have plenty of food. If I run out, I could always buy food in the towns, although I had very little money left. I didn't think shelter was going to be a problem. During the day, I'd keep my helmet on to protect me from the sun, and at night, I'd start a fire and wrap myself in my sleeping bag. At about 7 in the morning, I found a good spot to camp, near the large boab tree. Boabs are squat trees with trunks as wide as 30 feet in diameter. They look as though they had been uprooted and put back in the ground upside down. As the sun set, the temperature dropped dramatically. It wasn't as cold as the highlands of Nairobi, but it was still a relief from the heat of the day. I gathered wood and built a small fire. I leaned against the trunk of the tree and swatted at flies. I was exhausted and sore. I didn't know if this was from the beating or if it was I was just out of shape. I'd made pretty good time, but the ride had been mostly downhill. I wondered what it would be like once I left the paved roads. I took the water bottle out of the pannier and thought about squirting some into my mouth. Then put it back without opening it. I needed the water tomorrow. The soup would be enough fluid for now. When the soup was ready, I made myself eat it very slowly. By the time I was finished, it was dark. A light breeze began to buffet the flames on the fire. I unrolled my sleeping bag, lay on top of it, and fell into an exhausted sleep. The next morning, I awoke just as the sun was rising. I packed my things and left the camp without eating because I wanted to take advantage of the relatively cool morning. I reached Suswa by mid-morning and only stayed there long enough to replenish my water and buy a couple of loaves of bread. I pedaled steadily throughout the day. The farther west I went, the more animals I saw. Small groups of Thompsons, gazelles, giraffes, bushbucks, topi zebras, and impalas grazed by the roadside. During the hottest part of the day, the animals stood in the scant shade of the acacia trees. That night, I camped by the roadside again. I was too tired to start a fire. The soup was warm anyway from sitting in the pannier all day. The next afternoon, I filled my water bottles in the small town of Sewabi. Outside of town, I stopped on a bridge and got out my map. The river under the bridge was called the Siwili-Pau. I followed into the Sasso Negro, which was the river that ran along the base of the Garuman Escarpment, where my father's camp was located. My original plan was to keep heading west past Narok, and then take a dirt road south to Mahurjo, and then head east over to the Libertero Hills. It was a roundabout way to my father's camp, but at least I'd be near roads and civilization in case something happened. On the other hand, if I left the road now and followed the river, I'd save a lot of time. Not only that, but I would have a source of drinking water along the way. I looked at the water below the bridge. The banks of the river were very steep. The only way down to the water were narrow paths made by animals. A green scum grew on the surface, and there was hardly any flow. The water would have to be purified. I had tablets to remove the bacteria. I stared at the map and tried to imagine what it would be like traveling along a river. It was at least 70 miles to my father's camp, and there were no towns or settlements along the route. It was getting late, and I was too tired to make a rational decision, so I decided not to decide. I made camp, ate a can of food, swatted at flies, and when it got dark, I fell asleep. The next morning, I opened my eyes just as the sun was rising, and I lay there breathing the cool morning air. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and listened. I heard birds chattering and the light breeze blowing through the trees. The sound reminded me of a camping trip with my father when I was 8 years old. One night, the wind began to really blow, and not far away from us was a coyote started yapping. I was frightened. There's nothing to be afraid of. The wind and coyote belong there. Just listen to them. Imagine that you're a coyote standing on a ridge, howling into the wind. I learned to listen on that trip and not to be afraid of what I heard. I slowly opened my eyes. Weaver birds were tending their delicate teardrop-shaped nests. The nest hung from the branches like Christmas tree ornaments. I walked up to the road and looked west, then turned and looked south along the river. I decided that it was time to venture into the real Africa. I got out my compass and plotted a course on the map. I packed my panniers, took a long drink of water, and began following the river. Throughout the day, I followed a crude trail along the river. The ride was difficult. I stopped every 10 miles, drank water, reset the odometer on my bike, and started off again. The water level in the river dropped drastically. In some places, there was no water at all, just a wide expanse of dried, cracked mud. Late that afternoon, about halfway through my third 10 miles, a warthog and her 3 babies blasted out some bushes right in front of me. I skidded into a stop and watched them run away as my heart pounded in my chest. I stayed there until my pulse returned to normal. A couple of miles later, it suddenly became very difficult to pedal. I stopped and saw that my rear tire had gone flat. By the time I got it changed, it would be time to make camp. 28 miles wasn't too bad for my first day on the road. If I kept up that pace, I would be at the Garuma escarpment in 3 days, way ahead of schedule. I took the tire off and saw that I had run over a thorn. I patched it and began to fill it with the hand pump. It was a long, sweaty job. When the tire was half inflated, I paused for breath, then froze. I didn't know why, but I knew that something was behind me. The hair on my back of my neck stood on end. It's your imagination, Jake. Now that you're really in the bush, your mind is playing tricks on you. Very, very slowly, I turned my head. 50 feet away, lying in a crouched position, was a male lion. His battle-scarred face was surrounded by dark bushy mane. His black-tipped tail flicked from side to side. So much for my imagination. My mouth felt like it was stuffed with an old sock. A feeling of dread spread through my body. My mind raced, but I remained perfectly still. I'd been around lions in the zoo, but this was entirely different. The only thing you can do if you're face-to-face with a lion is to stay still. The zookeeper's theory was not to panic. Easy thing to say. The lion's golden eyes drilled into me. If he'd attacked, I'd be torn to shreds. In my imagination, I heard my bones snapping as the lion ate me. When he finished, the jackals and vultures would pick up my bones clean and spread them along the river. Then the porcupines and rodents would gnaw on my bones until they were all gone. After I was digested by the various animals, I would become part of the African ecosystem forever. I didn't want to stay in Africa quite that long. If I'd run, he'd be on me faster than I could blink. I could barely breathe, and the flies were driving me crazy. The lion stood up. Here it comes. Snap, snap, snap! He yawned, and I saw his huge, yellowed canine teeth. He shot squirts of pee out behind him, then scraped the dirt over the piss with his hind paws and lay back down. I knew how a mouse felt when he was cornered by a domestic cat. My legs began to go to sleep, but I wouldn't be able to hold my position much longer. His tail began to flick back and forth again. The sun was going down. I had to do something. The only weapon I had was a tire pump, which was still attached to the stem of the tiger. I tightened my grip on the pump, took several deep breaths, and counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. As soon as I moved, he started towards me. Using the pump's rubber hose as a sling, I hurled the tire at him. The tire bounced off his forehead. He roared at the impact. All 4 paws came off the ground, and before he came back down, he had twisted his body in the other direction. He hit the ground running and disappeared into the bush. I stared at the space he had occupied seconds before. I wondered if it had actually happened, but it must have, because the tire and the pump were 20 feet away. I stood up, my legs were shaking badly, and I had to swallow several times to keep bile from coming up. I walked over to the tire, and I saw the spot where he had scraped dirt over his piss. It had happened. The pump was still attached to the tire, and it didn't look damaged. I carried it back to my bike and sat down. Numbly, I gathered wood for a fire. There was plenty of it around, and it was as dry as tissue paper. I piled the wood up, dropped a match on it. In a second, I had a bonfire going. I hoped it would keep the animals